you said you worked on Honduras and Nicaragua, and as you say, they're neighboring countries in Central America, but probably quite a number of our listeners won't know that much about them. So perhaps you could take us through what the differences are between them, but also what they have in common.
Sure. Well, geographically, they're the two largest countries in Central America, and they're neighbours. So Nicaragua is the largest country, but it's still only the size of England and Wales, and has a much smaller population, of course. So our population is about 6.5 million. Honduras is slightly smaller geographically and has got a population nearing 10 million. So it's about half as big again. And they share the distinction, if that's the right word, of being the two poorest countries in Latin America. The only one that's poorer is Haiti in the Caribbean. But they've got a very different political history. So Nicaragua had a revolution in 1979. There was then a decade of revolutionary government, but very much attacked by the US during the Contra War, where the US supplied weapons to Contra forces who were fighting against the Nicaraguan government. And although the Sandinista government won re-election in 1984, it lost it in 1990. And that led to 16 years of neoliberal government, and then a new period of Sandinista government from 2007. And in a way, Honduras went in the opposite direction because it never had a revolution, and it had a series of neoliberal governments, but then had a reformist progressive government in 2007 until 2009, when there was a military coup and Manuel Zelaya, the then president, was literally taken out of the presidential palace in his pajamas and sent out of the country. And it then had neoliberal government from 2009 until last year, when Xiomara Castro won on a progressive agenda for the Libre Party, and she took power just in January, but is already struggling to really dominate a country which is badly split between people who support her and the businesses who support the National Party, which was the traditional neoliberal party in Honduras that lost power last year.
So you've had your description is really important, because in the decade running up to the COVID pandemic, you basically had very different political frameworks. You had a neoliberal framework in Honduras, and then you had the Sandinistas, which, as you say, had always been a left-wing revolutionary movement named after Sandino, who had been a left-wing politician. And I can't remember in which country. Actually, I think it was Nicaragua in the 1950s and 60s, I believe. But you had, and that was in Nicaragua. So you had this left-wing and right-wing difference between them in the way in which they were governed in that decade. So how did that affect the nature of the public health services in the run-up to the pandemic then in those two countries?
Well, again, it's very interesting that the two adjoining countries to have such a different situation when the pandemic hit in 2020. So by then, there'd been 15 years of Sandinista government here in Nicaragua, and they've been able to do what they hadn't been able to do during their first period of government, because the economy was in such a mess with the sanctions from the US at that time. But in the last 15 years, they've made this massive investment in all sorts of public services, but particularly in health. So since 2007, the government has built 24 new public hospitals, for example. It's reopened or modernized or built thousands of local health centers and health posts. It's created a system of casas maternas, that sort of maternity houses that women who are pregnant can go in and be cared for in the weeks preceding birth. And of course, it's invested in things like piped water supply, which now covers the majority of the country. Electricity covers practically 100% of households. And as a result of anti-poverty programs, it's succeeded in reducing poverty from about half the population to around 20% of the population or less by now. In Honduras, they experienced the problem of recovering from the devastating effects of Hurricane Mitch in 1998, which also hit Nicaragua, but only one part of Nicaragua. And Honduras took much longer to recover from the hurricane.
Right.
Life expectancy had increased temporarily. Public spending increased under Manuel Zelaya, but then closed again, fell again. When he was deposed, there were 28 public sector hospitals, but coverage of the country was very poor, and poverty started to rise again in the period before the pandemic.
And also, from what I've understood, also there was quite a lot of problem with urban violence as well in Honduras.
Yes, the social contexts are very different too, despite the proximity of the two countries and the fact that the people are very similar in many ways. The revolution here in Nicaragua meant that, for example, the police and the army were completely reformed. So we've had a community-based police system now, really, since 1979.
Mm-hmm.
And this has meant that there isn't the same terrible gang problem that exists in Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala to the north of here. There isn't the same level of problems with drug running and laundering of money and all this kind of thing associated with the drug trade, which is interrelated with the gangs problem. And in Honduras, for many years during the neoliberal government, it was one of the most dangerous countries in the world. San Pedro Sula, the second main city, was for several years the most dangerous city in the world, other than those that were actually at war, because of the numbers of murders. And of course, this affects very much people's perception of both of the country and of their own health and their access to health services. And whereas in Nicaragua, there's an expectation that health services will work and popular demand that they're improved all the time. In Honduras, people may have wanted that, but have been found it very, very difficult to achieve improvements in services, especially because of the corruption which was eroding the national budget and the health service budget in particular.